Alright, here we go. Something of an oh gods moment here. It's been a long trek to try to get this to the table, not just because there's tons and tons of other games that, this is going to take me at least 3 months, I think, at my current rate of playing to get through. Unless I get really, really excited by it. But it could actually take longer because I'm worried about it. Anyway, beyond that, facing the rules again, the times I've played it previously, the first time I bought it, I was so excited about this game. I mean, this was the game I dreamed about a couple weeks before I saw it. I was thinking, man, somewhere over here, Empires and Arms was on my mind, and I was reading a Trevelyan book, I think, or else Cato's Letters, and I kind of merged the cover of that book with Empires and Arms, and I came up with really very much this map, although with less color, and but of the world, and it was just I saw it. It was a beaten up copy. This split side was already there. I think it was $40. And this was a glorious find for me. One of two in that era, the other one being Thunder at the Crossroads. Anyway, what is this thing? So the designer himself puts it out as a combination of Empires and Arms and Conquistador, and I'd say it throws in some more stuff. In terms of the movement and combat system, especially the combat, it is very much like Empires and Arms. In terms of the spirit of, you got this whole world to colonize, it's sort of like Conquistador, maybe a little more like Viceroys there. To tell you the truth, there's nothing quite like it. Probably the closest thing is the computer game that was derived from it. When and the computer game does a much better job, especially EU2. There's a mod, 2 historical mods were combined, just tons of richness and depth. But there's still something about getting a game on the table and playing it on the board that is just so much more exciting to me in some ways. Less addictive, though. Less demanding in terms of, you must play. And in fact, one of the things that slowed my bringing this to the table was I started playing another Paradox game, Crusader Kings 2. I loved Crusader Kings. I'm not feeling the love on this one. But anyway, on to this game. What is it, and what is it portraying? Well, it's portraying from 1492 to 1792 world history from a Eurocentric point of view. There are another of the factors that kind of jumped in my way here was EU 8 or 9, depending on how you want to look at it, which I have the rules for it kicking underneath the extension number 2, which I also don't have pieces for. I have the rules for EU 8 kicking around. This is a 6-player game. This is the original game with one modification. I'm going to be using a different set of events. In fact, it's the first time I'm using them, but they're widely regarded as a big improvement in the game. These are known as the Risto events. I think that's after the guy's name. I remember not long after they came out, lots and lots of discussion and just on the bulletin boards and just commitment to them, but I never printed them out until now. I printed out the EU 8 rules though, and honestly it's very close, but the game has a different map. It has some slight differences in rules, especially to accommodate some of the extra players. So, for example, Poland is handled in much more depth than it. In the original game that we're playing, well, with the original events at least, Poland had a tendency not to really fall apart, and because miners are pretty resilient in it. And I'm afraid it'll still be the same no matter what you play. Maybe it's just me not being able to handle major powers well. All right. Let's take a look at a sequence of play. And this is, kind of all the paperwork and bookkeeping involved in this. This is a game that's very, very intensive in terms of charts and tables. Each player has their own relatively distinct set of information about their country, and then some stuff that's generic in here, the combat tables of various types, and this is for investments, which is again generic. But one page of a 4-page booklet that each player gets is specific to their country. It's not enough, though, to define all the specific rules for your country. Some of them are interspersed inside the main rule book, and yes, mine is very worn. I have an extra copy of this game, but I just can't break down besoiling it, even though I'll probably never sell it. Then there's this book of Annexes, which we'll get to in a minute. But then there's also scenario book, which contains some special information on some of the countries for the scenario in particular. So for example, and this is kind of weird, in this one there's like special rules for Portugal's establishment of Goa in this scenario. And I was kind of worried. I don't think it's interspersed elsewhere through here. Also in here you've got charts and tables for different objectives. Players have to pick objectives for the different periods. The game divides the time period into, I want to say 8. I don't know if that's correct. Maybe 7 periods. 7 sounds right. Let's see what we got at the end here. Lots of little maps. And I've got little photocopies of that map. And I've played out, some of my older games I recorded on those. I've got 3 or 4 sets of them. And that's not all the times I played. Yeah, 7 periods. And they're of different length. Each has their own campaign game. In addition, the game also has small scenarios, which I don't know quite how to put them, because usually they're like an hour or 2 to play out, maybe a little longer with things like the 30 Years' War. But in general, you're just moving a couple of stacks of units around on the board, fighting out, a fairly simple military system. Empires and Arms' military system is probably on par. They're very similar. But here, it's so little of the game that it's kind of funny to see that played out. And there's no real diplomacy or anything. And no production, none of that. In these little scenarios, you're just really fighting things out using the system. And it's interesting to do that. But, there's better games to handle, say, the 7 Years' War than trying to play it out on EU. Although one great thing about it that nothing really handles very well otherwise is that it's got the world aspect. So if you're fighting the 7 Years' War or anything later, you kind of get that whole world view in a fairly light game, to tell you the truth, once you cut away the rest. All right. So what else do you have? Yeah, we didn't get to the annexes. The annexes cover special rules for each country. And we're not talking about the major powers here. We're talking about every single country in the game, because most of them, every minor country. And that's most of the countries. There's a few countries that are never minors. For example, England and France. They're played in every scenario fully. What's kind of weird in this is in the 7 periods, the choices for who plays what are different from who's going to play them in the grand campaign game. So for example, Turkey and Spain are always major powers, but I don't think they are in the 7th scenario, for example, where you start adding Austria and Prussia. The problem is you can't just make Austria is a potential player, but you can't just make Prussia and Austria necessarily major power players, because they might have gotten so hosed by the actions in the game prior. That's not a big concern, though. Balance is really lacking in this. So this first scenario, I'm playing the Grand Campaign, and you've got all the leaders set up. This is the year chart going, 5-year turns. The first scenario is unbalanced. I played the minor campaign, and man, I mean, it's impossible to win with some of these countries. Portugal and Spain have this great advantage because they can go out and explore. Some of the others, Turkey maybe, although I've never seen them do well enough to meet their goals. Venice has kind of an interesting, tricky way that they can score a lot of points in Italy that I saw played out once. But it's not appealing to my style of play. All right. And let's take a look at what kind of comprises the game, and looking at the sequence of play can give us some of that. Oh boy. All right. So the beginning, each turn begins, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, with some quick checks on your monarchs. Now, I had to make all these little player aids, these cards, to cover the information that each country has, that otherwise I have some printed out sheets that didn't come with the game, but that somebody made that are similar. But I like these cards. They're a little sturdier. Of course, I've written on them so many times and erased so many times that they're kind of getting to the end of their lifespan, especially a few of them. There's some tape and stuff to help them out. Anyway, you have your monarch listed up here, and at the beginning of the scenarios, that's always a fixed character. In fact, for the first part of the Grand Campaign, a lot of the monarchs are fixed almost throughout the entire thing. So, for example, with Spain, you've got 3 different monarchs coming into play, but they should cover the entire first period. For some of the other countries, though, you've got like one successor pre-planned, and then that's it. When you go into some of the later campaigns, well, they start the same kind of way, but they don't influence the Grand Campaign. You don't end up, coming in, reaching a certain period and getting a specific leader for the most part. That there is one caveat to that, which is some of the events, and this is a heavily event-driven game. Some of the and that's the one thing that's like so special about it compared to most of the other games that came before it. And in fact, not the only thing that came after that kind of plays on that is the CDG idea. And much weaker. So, where was I? Yeah, I was on the sequence of play, but I was thinking of something about this. Yeah, some of the events will bring for key leaders into play, like Peter the Great or Frederick the Great, as a monarch. Let's look a little bit more at some of the spaces on the board before we go into the play. So, Europe is actually where most of what's going on happens. Well, actually, most of it happens on these papers. Most of the game is on paper. But on the board, Europe is where most of the action's going. And you have it divided into provinces with some terrain on them. Each province has one city, which sort of represents the fortification level. They have an economic value in a number. And you'll see I have these counters spread out. Most of the counters that are spread out are just to delineate who owns what. Kind of loosely scattered control markers. On top of that, we have some military units. The bigger units, armies and fleets. Smaller units are detachments. For example, these are naval detachments here. These little guys out here are merchant fleets, tracked over on my cards. On the back of the card, I have spaces to keep track of how many points of merchants are in each fleet. Like I said, very, very bookkeeping intensive game. Likewise, for all the armies and everything, like in Empires and Arms, you have to keep track of how many are in them. Well, here you do it on paper. That reduces the footprint of the game. It actually takes less space to have the board and everything, but everybody's got to have their papers. So it probably works out pretty close to the same, but less things you can knock over. These are trade zones, which is where the merchants congregate. We've got different weather levels in the sea zones. Over here, this is the diplomacy track. Each miner in the game more or less is tracked with its own little marker, and it can be on one person's diplomacy track. Basically, you do a competitive die roll or just a die roll to move that marker along your own track, and there's different costs and penalties and bonuses for different countries. Over here, we have some more exciting stuff. First of all, we have more map at a different scale, obviously. We'll see there's gold mines here. There's some in Europe, but not many. We've got little natives here and values that reflect how many of them are present and how dangerous they are. We've also got little these colored things which indicate exploitable resources. If you have colonies or trading posts in those areas, you get the resources, and those resources, when sold, will be marked on here to indicate how many have been exploited, and then that affects the price. The more you sell, the more depressed the price becomes. Here's the turn track. You'll notice there's many counters on it. Those are all individual named leaders coming in at their era. This is kind of a weird feel to the game. I'm not sure how I liked it. It's always felt like a cheat to me, as did the events to some extent. But you know, it's a lot of what adds flavor to the game is that, you know, you have these specific people coming out. Like here's Abercrombie, and he's not very well rated. The numbers, the first number is a maneuver rating, the second is a firepower, and the third number is shock. Lots of other information in here, like this guy can go the rest of the world, but he's limited to the Americas. The turns he's there. On the back of each of these, there's going to be another leader who comes in a little later. They tend to generally be by country. Some of them are mixed. Those are a problem. Some of them are on the board at the same time as another leader, which is really kind of a, very few, but it's really kind of a bad situation where two people have that. This is the stability track. Now, if you've played Empires in Arms, you're familiar with that kind of idea of a national stability, and it works very similar in this case. But the national stability is much more detailed in Empires in Arms. Here, it ranges from positive to -3, and it covers a few things. One is your income. The higher you are up here, the better your income is. For the most part, it's at par, unless you're at +3. But as it goes down, you start getting a penalty to your income, a penalty to your monarch survival chances. In addition to that, it affects peace terms. If you go to war and your stability drops low enough, you're going to lose the war worse or gain less than if you can keep it up higher. And finally, if you spend a couple of turns down at -3, you must sue for peace. Your opponent doesn't have to take it. They usually will, but because it'll usually be a bad piece for you. Pieces are constrained in this game, not quite the same as Empires in Arms. Empires in Arms worries more about, I sue for this kind of piece. You don't have that kind of control in this. If you take a piece in this game, it's determined by how well you've done on the map, how many battles you've won, etc., and the difference in the stability. And you really don't have a lot of choice in that, except that you can always take a white piece, which resolves everything the way it was, and also gives both players a point of stability. Okay. Technology. Technology is tracked on two vectors in this, land and naval technology. Each major country has its own little markers for both. And then there's also some conglomerate, the white markers, which cover groups of minor powers. So for example, the Latin group, which is what most of the European powers are, is doing quite well here with a 9 naval and a 7 land to begin with. There's quirky things that happen with this. Basically, you're going to make investments, try to move forward, but when you hit these spaces, you kind of jump over them, and then you push that counter down, so a number of people can reach the same... I'll have to look at how that works specifically, actually. But usually one person breaks it in one turn, but then a number of people make it the next turn. Technology is important, no doubt. In terms of the combat tables that you're actually going to use, and not going to be able to say much about that at this point. Okay. Let me take a little break and put half of this up and then put the other half later. Okay, our friend the sequence of play. So like I was saying at the start, first you check your monarch to see if he survives. And the more chaotic things are, the less likely that is. And where do I find that? Damned if I know. Yeah, it's right at the top here, monarch survival. There's a little chart that tells you most of the modifiers, maybe not all of them. Who knows? Okay. If he dies, you have to roll up a new successor. And here is the third game that I think influenced this heavily, which is Empires of the Middle Ages. The monarch generation system is similar. It's not exactly the same, but basically you're rolling and you're getting ratings running between 3 and 9 in 3 areas. Let me see if I can remember the order. You've got a military, an administrative, and a diplomatic. I'm not sure that's the same order they place them in here. I've got to look that up. But your military is, to some extent, how easily you can make military advances with the game, with your country. But it also affects your leader's military ratings if you choose to take your king and make him into a general, or in the case of some, an admiral. The administrative is going to affect your chance or your bonuses on things like implanting colonies, improving your manufacturing. Hey, there's something I forgot to mention. These little guys here are your manufactories. And the like. And then finally, and also some major ratings, which is the DTI, Domestic Trade Index, and FTI, Foreign Trade Index, which can bring you a lot of money. Finally, the third is your diplomacy, which is probably the least important of the bunch, but it affects your ability to modify those little suckers and bring other people into position in your favor. I've found diplomacy is not really an effective way to improve your country's position. Although certainly having miners on your side in a war is helpful, it's a short-term benefit, and the other abilities help more with long-term benefits, especially the administrative. All right, events phase. Okay, so this is kind of cute. And this is the other thing that this here Annex book contains. First of all, it contains these economic random events, and I think there's it says 1 per player. Yeah, each player rolls one of those to affect their country, and it could be a revolt, it could be this, that, and the other. Most of them aren't terribly interesting. Much more interesting is, if I can find it, I don't even know where it is. Well, it doesn't seem to be there. Somewhere or another there's a chart for each era, and I don't know where I keep that. But where you roll, and it's similar to this, where you roll 2 dice to see what comes up, and you get a number and you look up that number. Well, the number you look up is per period. The charts are per period. It's possible to end up falling before or after your period, and you mark events off as you get them, so that in general they don't come back. So, if you get an event that starts the 7 Years' War, you're not going to see it happen again. I don't know where my table is for that. I'm not even sure quite what it looks like. It may be back here. There's something back here. I remember having photocopies of it, so I'll have to look for it. But anyway, what it's going to do is generate very specific events that either happened or could have happened in the given periods. That is one of the other real jumps that I would say I could never have designed this game, not just because of the historical effort in researching these out, which you have to say it was kind of questionable anyway. I mean, there are a lot of flaws in the event tables, which is why I'm going to be using this set of alternate events. Okay, so you roll those up, and you have per player economic events, and then you have 3 of these political events, and it's possible there's a 4th one each turn. Big things that kind of change the face of the world in some cases. In some cases, they might not really affect anyone. For example, the Mughal Empire starting back here. Who cares about that? And to tell you the truth, it really doesn't mean much. And there'll be events, covering how it grows and then how it collapses. And you're all just kind of watching it. And when it does collapse, it's about the time when people are ready to go in there heavily. So it doesn't really they don't all have earth-shaking effects on the game. But a lot of them are going to be, hey, you got to do this. And if you don't do this, you're going to get a victory point penalty. And then if you do this, somebody else has got to do something. And just this chain reaction, some of the bigger ones, things like the 30 Years' War, they're just, a couple of pages. Let's see if we can find one. In here, there are the events. Here are the tables for the period events. And then they have, this is for determining, this is for the economic events, seeing which province gets affected or by revolts and such not. I don't know where the other one is. I'll look it up. So in here you have the political events. Here's the 30 Years' War. Woom, woom, woom. Down to here. So some of these events can be quite detailed, and it's not too surprising since there are scenarios meant to be played in a few hours and meant to be interesting, and they do tend to be, just not as interesting as they could be. Covering some of those major events. There are others that may not have much effect in this game. So the 6-player game, I haven't explained who's playing what, but you've got some permanent powers in the 6-player game. England, France, Spain, and Turkey. They're going to remain as those countries for the entirety of the game. Then there's 2 players who shift. One of them is Venice, who gets to shift to the Habsburgs after 2 periods, which makes to the Dutch and the Dutch Revolt. And then they have the option, and this I've never actually seen it taken for various reasons, to move from the Dutch to the Habsburgs. And that's, I think, after the War of Spanish Succession. And I've never seen the War of Spanish Succession actually happen, I think, so. Or maybe it's Austrian Succession that's never happened, Spanish has. Something like that. Okay. The other one is Portugal, who moves to be Russia. Now, out of all the players, Turkey I've found very hard to play. They tend to have difficulty making their goals in this first period quickly enough. And then by the time that they've finally cleared out the Mamluks and the Knights, and maybe, the Hungary and stuff like that, and they're ready, well, they're already becoming quite weak. They're collapsing. Their technology has dropped well below the rest of Europe. Initially, they're very, very powerful. So I think they're usually out of it in the game. And in victory points, they tend to lose a lot of victory points for some of their options. Out of the temporary players, I've seen Portugal makes tremendous points. Portugal in the first period probably should win. If it's not them, it's Spain, but usually Spain has too many other problems on their hands. Venice usually doesn't do too well in that first period, but as the Netherlands, because trade is very, very valuable in this game, I've usually seen them do very well. Maybe not be able to win, but be up in the running for it. But Portugal has a problem. They become Russia. And you would think, oh, Russia, tiny little country at this point, has this opportunity to grow throughout all of this, grow across here. And to tell you the truth, I've seen them grow. I just haven't seen them make points. The victory point system, and I haven't seen them grow as well as they did historically. The victory point system is really harsh on Russia. And you end up losing points left and right. And you can't really fight wars because you're against Western powers because you're just so backwards. Not that that's a big deal. But when you're having trouble against somebody like Poland, who's already holding much of the territory you're expecting to get, and you have several automatic wars against Poland, it's really painful. All right. Let's get back to wherever we were. Okay. Then you go to a diplomatic phase. Now, you can make diplomacy with one another, and you can trade, give money and sell provinces with royal marriages and stuff like that. But the main focus of this tends to be on trying to invest money in getting other powers, these minors, to be more aligned with you. Like I said, in general, that's not a great investment. There's better things to do with your money. If you have it, though, if you have these alliances, they can be very helpful if you go to war. I just don't tend to think in those lines, so it's harder for me to make that move. Because I'm expending something that I could be building my country up to be stronger later, either economically or technologically, as opposed to, hey, if I get that alliance now and launch my war now, I'll be in good shape. I just don't think that way very well, and that may be the problem. Okay, then we go to an income and an administrative phase, and these are kind of linked together. The income phase, you're filling out your tax forms. Let's see. Everybody's got a copy of one of these. Now I'm using one copy for everyone and just using them in different columns, erasing, combining, using the calculator for a lot of the calculations, and coming up with a total amount of money. Once you have money, and that's determined through a number of things, the size of your provinces, the colonies you have, whatever rare resources you're extracting if you're selling them, all kinds of stuff factors into that, the manufactories you have. Once you have the capital, then you can spend it on, well, first of all, on your troops and such not, but also on administrative actions. And that's what the backside here is all about. This is where you make your investments, and you'll be rolling to improve either manufactories, your indices, ship placement for the merchant ships, blah, blah, blah. It all uses pretty much the same mechanism, which is you calculate out what your modifiers are, and then you roll a die. And modifiers usually include your monarch's rating. Some things are more difficult than others. They just have their own penalties. You can also take out loans at this point. Alright. For the military phase, initiative is determined by the Monarchs ratings. The better the Monarch, the better your initiative, which allows you to go... I don't remember if it's earlier or choice. Damn. Another thing I have to look up. But it is to your advantage, generally, to go earlier. Because when you're exploring, if you're the first guy there, you're the first guy there. And in military situations, there's not a real disadvantage to attacking. You might say there should be a wait and see, but the truth of the matter is, who you're at war with, and you have to formally declare war. It costs you stability to declare war. That's done in the diplomacy phase. You kind of glossed over that, or just ignored it. It costs you stability to declare war, but if you have a casus belli, it costs you less stability. So it costs normally 2, it costs 1 if you have a casus belli. There's free casus belli, automatic declarations, all kind of weird stuff from the events. And some from positions, like if somebody has one of your home territories. Okay, the military phase itself is pretty simple. It's a movement, combat, and siege if you win the combat. Movement and combat are very similar to Empires and Arms, really. Differences, when you're sailing in the unknown world, if you don't know the provinces, you have to have an explorer or a conquistador if you're walking, in general, to go into new provinces. And you have to make a roll to explore chart on the chart. And then only you know those territories. You have to write that down, more bookkeeping, because in a certain number of turns, it kind of washes out and everybody learns them. If you move too far, like more than 6 movement points, you take attrition. So here's the combat. You have these modifiers based on technological differences, and you combine the two technologies. And you're going to be rolling first a fire and then a shock round of combat. You get on a certain chart, and you do a percentage of your strength as damage to the opponent. Again, pretty much like an Empires and Arms type game. There may be a little bit more complexity in this in some ways, but less in others because you don't have chit picks and stuff. This is for miners. They get reinforcements off a die roll during the administrative phase. Sieges themselves, you roll on the siege table, and you're slowly trying to get bonuses on that table. A lot of games do that. And eventually, you either get a breach, a surrender, or an honors of war choice. If you get a breach, you're allowed to assault. You may be allowed to assault without a breach. It's generally a very bad idea. Early in the game, you're using medieval technology. There's no actual fire phase. That's a little ahistorical because everybody had cannons at this point, or everybody major had cannons. But until you hit this first land one, Renaissance, you don't have a fire phase in the land combat. I think the naval combat still does. Could indicate that they're just not prevalent enough. And you'll see here we have different charts to indicate how your troops are. So for example, in different eras you have different sized armies and different sized fleets that you're allowed to have. And in some cases that's kind of weird. And you can buy these things either as package deals or individually strength point by strength point. Okay. Pirates and privateers, yeah. We got these little guys on the map, and they're allowed to sail out, and other countries have privateers as well. They're allowed to sail out and kind of pick on the merchant shipping and having navies, etc., in place, you can try to kill them when they do that. In general, there's some special ones. The North African privateers and the knights are able to kind of do this without being in a state of war. Otherwise, you have to be in a state of war. Exception to that, I think, is the English sea dogs. They're allowed to kind of cheat too. Okay. The military phase. So, the game is handled turn by turn with 5-year turns, but combat is handled in rounds. And after the first round, you start rolling a die to see if the turn ends. If you roll under the just ended round, I think, the turn ends. So it's very unlikely for it to get very high. Usually they take 4 or 5 rounds, about 1 per year. But sometimes there'll be more. And you just don't know how many actions you're going to have. Let's see what else we got here. Redeployment phase. Now, people have to go home in this game, and that's a shame, because this is the same problem I had with God Kings. Every 5 years, if you haven't gotten your siege underway, you've got to retreat back. It's not as extreme as in God Kings, but it still feels fake. I've got 5 years, where I can campaign solidly through those 5 years, as long as there's no bad weather mark or anything. But if I don't get my situation handled within those 5 years, if I don't get what I want done, I start over. I fall back to my own lines. It just feels weird. And likewise, all the diplomacy and everything, once every 5 years. Again, it just feels weird. Okay. During that phase, you can pillage territories you're sitting in. Revolts and stuff grow. And you'll see there's, over here on the counter piles, there's these little revolt markers. They can turn into actual military units if things get bad enough, and in some events. You also get any money, any gold that you produced coming back from Europe, coming back to Europe. There's also these fleets that happen during the action phase, special fleets, trade fleets basically. One for the Orient, one to move the overland stuff from the Orient across the Med. And then there's also a bullion fleet for the Spaniards. That's a way of them moving their money or their gold. Then you hit the peace phase. Each player is allowed to spend money, like in the administrative phase. In this case, though, just to increase their stability. And then players resolve their pieces. Now, the pieces, with neutrals, you roll on a table in general, apply some modifiers, and see what they accept. With players, though, it's just a calculation of, hey, how many battles did I win? What's our modifier from that? And what's the difference between these? And yeah, I'm willing to take that if you are. You don't have an option, though. You can't tweak those peace results. You can't say, oh man, I really need out of this war. I'll give you something more. Except in terms of, okay, we'll do the peace we're doing now, but we'll make a royal marriage next turn, and I'll give you a province during that. It's the only way you can transfer provinces. And then in the interphase, I don't remember what prosperity is. Death and placement of new leaders. You get new leaders on the board from the turn. These leaders just pretty much die automatically by the turn that they're supposed to come out. The only exception is they can get killed in combat. They can get captured too. And then you determine victory points, which we got kind of these. There's costs for declaring war, but there's bonuses for having trade, for putting new trading posts and colonies down, for having a monopoly in a resource, whatever. All these things can generate victory points. You got to kind of look through the list. And after playing a couple of turns, it becomes much, much easier. Right now, everything's this amorphous blob as I'm trying to try to remember how this played. I've read the rules. I've read them a couple of times recently, but they just don't stick. Now, not everything's going to stick no matter what, but most of the things become kind of automatic, and yeah, I'll probably screw them up, but whatever. At least it'll be consistent. Okay, and then you advance the turn marker. Now, here's what's weird. Oh, inflation somewhat based on the amount of gold you haul back to Europe, but also it just randomly increases throughout the game. And that reduces how much your money's worth. If you hauled gold into Europe, your money goes down by more than if you didn't. So, you do not want to produce gold outside of Europe if you only produce a little bit, because it's going to hurt your bottom line in the end. You'd be better off not producing gold. Alright. Lots I didn't cover, lots I can't cover. This is a huge and very detailed game. One thing that I didn't cover, though, was the period victory points. So in each period, players have to select from this Chinese menu. Each power has its own set, and you have to pick 4 of these. Now, these are just totally unbalanced. Some of them are contradictory and wrong. But you pick and categorize them A, B, C, and D. You get more points for your A. If you picked something and you don't get it, you pay the penalty price at the end of the period. If you didn't pick it and you didn't get it, you pay half the penalty price. I'll come back when I'm ready to start and go over what some of the choices were. I couldn't even set up the game until I could figure those out, because really there's very little setup to do, but in terms of where you're going to place your military units at the beginning of the game, not that you have a lot. I mean, look, here's big France, big major power, 2 stacks. Spain, 1 area with military units, and then some fleets ready to go out with Columbus. There just aren't. Ooh, I forgot to set up. I didn't get the troops set up for the Turks yet. Darn. Got to fix that, because they're going to be going after the Mamluks. All right, that's it. I'll be starting playing, and I'm out of video.